All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Friday Live Code Review. I'm going to do something a little bit different today. Spencer has graciously agreed to let me use his movie search CLI code. And what I'm going to do today, instead of kind of going through it and doing a review, because I think we reviewed this project at least once or twice before, is I'm actually going to take it and then do some refactoring and build on it, which I think will be maybe a little more interesting. And is a little bit of a code review in a way, because it'll kind of show you some ways that things could be done differently. But let me share my screen. So the spec for the movie search CLI is to write an application that and I'm way out where I need to be. I want to be in code reviews. Here we go. So this is an application that allows you to search for movie names using the IMDb website. So when you run it, it looks something like search, and then you give it some name, and it will search for movies. It'll take a minute. There we go. And it gives these results, right? Rocky. And what it's doing is it's hitting a certain page on IMDb. It's hitting the IMDb search page, basically. And it is scraping that page and getting results. So IMDb. So it's basically hitting this page here. And then it's like parsing the HTML and pulling out these individual names. So we can see here if I search for Rocky. There's these results here from the page, 1976, 1981. Those are the ones that are coming back in my results. So it's just like a little command line utility that wraps this IMDb page and makes a HTTP request to IMDb, pulls down the HTML, parses it to find these movie names, and then prints them out to the screen. So that's the code that we're going to be looking at. And we will look through the code, and then we'll look to see if there's opportunities for refactoring in here. But let's go ahead and start looking through this. So we've got this, we saw how it worked. You node the JavaScript file and then something you're trying to search for. And it send stuff back. Looks like it's not working great with spaces, but if I take the spaces out, it can certainly find Nemo. So what we're going to do is go through and look at the code here. So we've got this sort of one top-level method here, search IMDb, that takes a search term and a callback. And then it hits IMDb. Oh, actually, this will work out great. So it hits IMDb using HTTP GET, passes in a host and a path. It's kind of putting the search term right there in the query string, and then pulling out the status code from the result, throws a nice error if IMDb is down for some reason or the request fails. That's nice. So it sets an error, and then it says, if there's an error, we're going to console log the error, and then response resume, return, which kind of, we can bail out here with the return. Otherwise, we're doing a set encoding on the response, and then registering these methods on data and end that will like read in all of the HTML from the response. So we kind of add all the chunks to the, so data gets called with each like piece of the response as it comes back, as it's being sent over the internet. So this could get called multiple times with like chunks of the page as it's loading. So we're just kind of adding those all together in this raw HTML. And then end is the thing that gets called once all the data has been received. So that thing is calling get movie titles to turn raw HTML into movie titles, it looks like, and then invoking the callback. Otherwise, if there's an error for some reason on the whole request, you call the callback with the error. So that all looks pretty straightforward. And movie titles is using Cheerio here, it looks like, to find the right pieces in the HTML. I'm going to gloss over that a little bit. It looks right to me. And then run search seems to be what's happening when we actually invoke this command. And we're taking the arguments and joining them together with plus signs, which is probably how I could have done multiple arguments. Let's see, if I hadn't used, are you kidding me? Let's do it this way. If I had not have used spaces and just said finding Nemo, looks like that plus sign would, yeah, there we go. So spaces are invalid in a URL. So if I pass in an argument that has spaces in it, it'll get stuck into that query string, and that's why we get that error that I was getting earlier. Request path contains unescaped characters. HTTP client is not happy with me using spaces there. So let's look at this code for a minute. So what I want to talk about today is refactoring, and this is actually going to work better than I thought it would for that. So refactoring is the process of taking some code and changing it in some way to improve the like quality of the code or the readability of the code. Those are the most common cases you'll hear refactoring discussed, but you might also do refactoring to improve performance. You're sort of changing something about the quality or the essence of the code without changing what the code is doing. And a good prerequisite for any sort of refactoring, right? If I want to change code, but make sure I don't change the way it behaves, you want to have tests around it. And that's how you know that you didn't break something while you were rewriting code, that it still works the same way it used to. Okay, so we've got some tests here that are going to help us make sure we don't break anything. And what refactoring, give me some of this here. What directory are we in? I'm going to open up another terminal in this directory. Mocha reporter spec, interesting. So one of the things Mocha gives us is this watch command. Now I got to call it from node modules. But if we call the Mocha command directly, node modules.bin, we can add this watch parameter, and this will start the tests and then just kind of keep them going. Notice it didn't finish. And every time I change the code, the test will automatically rerun. This is super handy. I'm going to keep this open while we do this. And so if I in the process of like refactoring this code, break something, we'll see it immediately, which is one of the great reasons to write tests for your code. It makes coming in to change it a lot easier. So let's come through here and refactor this. So there's a few things a few reasons we might want to refactor code. What I'm going to focus on today is refactoring code so that it's more readable, and so that it's more modular. So let's just start with more readable or cleaner, right? So when we come into this function, the first thing we've got a let here, and then we're checking the status code, and then in an if statement, and then if that's true, then we're setting an error. And then we come out of that if block, and we go into another if block that checks for the presence of this error. And this is kind of, it looks to me like we've got a possibility here to combine these two if blocks, right? If this one's true, then this second one will always be true, right? Because if status code is not equal to 200, we're always going to set this error variable. And if we set the error variable, then the second if block will get hit. And if status code is 200, we won't set this error variable, and we'll never get in this if block. So these two if blocks are actually testing the exact same thing. So we could probably just merge them. And if we merge them, then this error variable, this error variable is only used inside this block. So we can actually get rid of that and just make it a const in here, right? Create the error, log it out, return. So what does that look like? Tests are still passing. That's helpful. Let's just, to be a little more thorough, let's come in here and do app search rookie. The other thing that I'm wondering is this response.resume. We're resuming, but then we're just returning. We're not like doing anything with the rest of the stuff we're reading. So I'm wondering if we comment that out, if it makes a difference. And it looks like it doesn't. So I think this is probably just unnecessary, which is another way we can kind of shorten this up. So now this kind of starts to look a little bit more concise. So then we are setting and encoding the UTF-8 and then building this raw HTML. This like song and dance about like let raw HTML and then register data and register this end thing. These are it's a bit of an awkward way to do it, but it is the right way to do it. It's just that asynchronous code sometimes is a little awkward. But I don't think there's a lot we can do to clean that up a lot. But one of the things that I want to look at is just the separation of concerns here. So this search IMDb method, one of the things you want to ask yourself about a module or about a function is, what does the code in this function have to know about? What assumptions is it making about the world? And you'll find that the more assumptions your code is making, the harder it is to reuse. So it lives in this world where a lot of things have to be true. It has to know a lot of things. So search IMDb, what does this thing know? It knows the URL for IMDb, right? It needs to know the host and the path name. That's kind of hard-coded in here. If any of those things change, this method would have to change. Or if I wanted to reuse this method to search some other site, like these things would have to change. And then it knows kind of how to make an HTTP request. It knows things about the HTTP protocol, like the fact that 200 is a success. It knows kind of how to handle that. It knows how to like read in this data. And then it knows that the data that it's retrieving is movie titles or is raw HTML that can be parsed to movie titles. So there's a couple different layers of abstraction going on here. There's this thing about, I know how to do an HTTP GET request and chunk data together and check status codes. And there's sort of that level of thinking. And then there's this higher level of thinking going on that says, oh, I actually know something about what this HTTP request means. I know that I'm fetching things from the IMDb site and that the things I'm getting back are movies. And so you've got two levels of abstraction going on in the same function. And in a function this short and in an application this short, like, yeah, you can still read through this code and understand what's going on. It's not that much of a cognitive load to come through and read this method and have to think about the HTTP protocol and movies and IMDb at the same time. But this kind of thing, as your application grows and gets more complicated, can start to hurt the ability you have to like read code and understand it easily, and also to reuse it. So what if we were to break apart those two things, right? What if we broke apart the responsibility for knowing about HTTP and the responsibility for knowing about the IMDb search page into two pieces? So we had like separate, we separated that logic out, we separated out those concerns. What would that look like? We can see we're already doing a little bit of that, in that what this method does not need to know about is how to parse HTML into movie titles, right? That's been moved into this great method called getMovieTitles. But search IMDb still has to know that that's the method to call, that for the thing that it's retrieving from the internet, the way to parse it is getMovieTitles. So let's break this up a little bit. And let's try and do it without breaking any tests in the process. So a lot of times what I like to do in this refactoring is to try and keep the test screen, keep the code running, and just make small changes that so the code is never broken for more than like, one save at a time, if any. So what if we turned, what if we, let's see, what's the best way to start with this? Let's pull the, let's do this. Let's create a new function called search IMDb. And let's rename this interior function here. Let's see, what's a good example? Parse web page. Scrape web page. We're going to come back to that name, but for now I'm going to say scrape web page. Scrape is a common term for like programmatically downloading HTML from a web page on the internet and like doing something with it. So we're going to call it scrape web page. So now I got some failing tests. Why is that? Because I just changed search IMDb to do nothing. So we'll get our tests working again really easily by just calling return scrape web page, search term, callback. Okay, so now we've done nothing except change some names, but we're making progress. So my goal here is to make scrape web page only know about how to go and get a web page and handle the like business of chunking HTML together and handling errors, and not know anything about movies or IMDb. So the first thing I'm gonna have to deal with is this business here, right? This host and path. This is very specific to IMDb. I don't want scrape web page to have to know that. And the way it gets away with not knowing that is having those things passed in. So what if I change search term here to just be the URL. And I'm going to do a little documentation check here, but I am pretty sure that the node HTTP get method can take just a URL. Let's go verify that. URL. New URL host. Oh, interesting path name, search params, username. I don't want that one. Let's see, HTTP get. There it is. Options. Yeah, it can just take a URL. So let's try this. What if we decided to, URL, options. We'll call them URL options. And we're going to just replace that hash with URL options. And instead of search term, we are going to say const URL options is this. And move URL options here. Okay, our tests are still passing. So see what we did there? We just took these URL options, right? And now scrape web page doesn't know anything about IMDb. It just knows, oh, I'm getting handed some options for a URL. I know how to fetch that. I know how to check for errors. I know how to like chunk data together. I'm still making this assumption that for some reason what you're scraping is probably movie titles, and I'm gonna parse them that way. But these two lines are now the only two lines in this function that know anything about IMDb or movies. And they really just know about movies, right? So how do we get rid of those guys? Well, this function already takes a callback. And the assumption that we're making here is that like that callback needs to get called with these parsed movie titles. But what if we made this function a little bit dumber so that we could move this movie logic out? And we decided that we're just going to call that callback with the raw HTML. Callback raw HTML. And then we can move these two things away. And so now we got to figure out what do we put up here, right? So now this thing is a callback that'll get called with raw HTML. And we can move our, I know I've gotten a paste buffer somewhere. There it is. We can move this stuff out here, right? So again, we've just made a small change here, and we took out the like movie logic here out of this end callback. And we're just passing the raw HTML basically out of scrape web page through the callback. And then up here in search IMDb, we have the details about, you know, how to parse it. So that's one way to do that. And that works. You'll notice our tests are still passing. And we have probably, if you look at this code versus the code that we started with, there are more lines in this file, right? Because now we're starting two functions. So we have two function headers and two function endings. But the extra lines that have been added are mostly like structure. They're just like start and end up function. But what we've done is we have sort of decoupled these two things. So now we have like a search IMDb method that all it knows about, notice search IMDb knows nothing about how to get information from the internet, right? All it knows is, it knows what a URL is, right? It knows, okay, this is the URL for IMDb. This is how IMDb, you know, search page URL works. And then it knows that what that page is going to return is raw HTML that represents a list of movies. Those are the only things it knows. So it has very like IMDb-centric knowledge. Get movie titles, on the other hand, knows about how to take HTML from an IMDb page and parse it, but it doesn't know anything about like how to get that HTML or what to do with the movie titles when it's done, right? And Scrape Web Page is this nice wrapper around HTTP GET that does all of this like ugly, boring stuff for us and handling errors. And if you look at Scrape Web Page, what we have now is a function that will scrape any web page on the internet and just pass the HTML to a callback. And that's actually like a really useful method, right? You don't want to have to write this 20 lines of code every time you need to hit a web page on the internet and just read the HTML. So now you've got a unit in your application that is very reusable, right? If you have an application that's hitting the IMDb website and is hitting one page in the IMDb website, you're probably going to be doing that a lot. And now you've got, you know, this code that you already wrote for your first application of like hitting IMDb is now ready to be reused for the next thing that you'll need it for. And it doesn't have any assumptions about like that initial usage. It's kind of stuck in its own domain. And search IMDb again is similar. So let's see, that's a good first round refactoring. Does anybody have any questions about this stuff so far? There's another option for how we could have broken these things apart. I want to kind of go down that rabbit hole, but I want to make sure we pause for questions. See if anybody has anything they want to ask. Okay, just jump in and interrupt me if you do. The one other thing I want to show is, so we could have done this a different way. So here, Scrape Web Page, we're Scrape Web Page takes a callback that gets invoked with just the raw HTML, and then we sort of parse it. So one thing we could do, if we wanted to, is we could add another option to Scrape Web Page called a parser. We could say, what if we let what if we let scrape web page accept not just a callback, but another function called a parser? And we said that it's always going to call that parser on the raw HTML before passing it to the callback. Let's break this up so it's a little clearer. Const parsed results. So that makes this function a little bit smarter, right? Because it can parse the results for us as long as we tell it, we give it a function that does the parsing, right? And then we could set the parser to get movie titles. And that lets us get rid of this step here. And then this callback simply becomes this is just going to be movie titles now. Movie titles. So it makes the calling syntax for scrape web page a little bit simpler, and it doesn't really add any like specific domain knowledge to scrape web page. All scrape web page knows now that it didn't know before is that the raw HTML can be parsed in some way, but it doesn't know how. It doesn't have to know what this parser does. It just has to know that like, oh yeah, that's the thing I can do for you. If you give me a function, I'll parse the HTML for you before I return it. So it's still kind of a nice separation, but it simplifies the way we call this because like scraping a web page and then parsing it in some way is going to be, could also be a pretty common thing. And those two ideas are pretty tightly coupled. And the fact is that this could actually get even simpler. Notice our callback here really doesn't do anything except call the callback that was passed into search IMDb. The only reason we have to actually like write it out in line here is because the callback that search IMDb accepts has this convention of passing an error first if there was an error, otherwise passing movie titles, or otherwise, yeah, being invoked with the result. But this callback that we're using here isn't following that convention. So we can just change that. We can make this callback follow that error first convention. And so now this becomes error movie titles, right? But it turns out now that we're just basically taking two arguments, right? And passing them straight into the other callback. So we don't actually need to write this all out in line at all. We can just pass, we can pass the outer callback straight in here, right? And I think I like that quite a bit better. So now this search IMDb function is really simple. I can come into this function and I figure it out really quick, right? What does search IMDb do? Well, it takes this IMDb URL, scrapes the web page, applies this parser to it, and then invokes the callback. So this function is like really easy to understand, and it's all operating at the same level of abstraction. And scrape web page, there's a little bit more going on here, but it all has to do with, you know, go get a page from the internet, read in the HTML, and then apply some parser to it, return the results. And then, you know, get movie titles is just that parser. And so, you know, you could write lots of different parsers like get movie titles for different types of IMDb pages. This code's going to be a lot more modular and easier to use and reuse later on, and also just easier to come in and understand. So now if I need to change something about like how the web page gets parsed, I don't have to read any of this code, right? This was all code that I had to sort of dig through if I wanted to come in and say, okay, wait, how are we parsing the HTML? I need to change that. I have to look at this all. I can just look here and say, oh, it's this thing that's getting passed in that's parsing it. So I can write a new function to pass in there. And like, it's just, there's like lots of lines of code that I don't even have to read. And the most readable code is the code that you never have to read, right? If I don't have to look at it at all, It's even better than it being super clear and readable, right? Like it makes the application as a whole easier to work with if it's easy for me to drop into a small piece of code and kind of understand everything it's doing, because it's not dealing with a whole bunch of stuff I don't care about. Okay, that's all that I've got for today. We got some time left, so if y'all want to just office hours and ask questions or go about with your learning on your own, that is fine with me. Just let me know. But if there aren't any other questions, I see you all around. And if I don't see you the rest of today, have a good weekend. All right, bye everybody.